So I'm TJ Van Tol. I work as a developer advocate at Progress, and I work mostly on NativeScript.
Could you tell me about how NativeScript is implemented and what, why you decided to implement it the way it is?
We have a long history of working with Cordova, and in fact, to this day, Progress, we maintain and build a lot of tools for Cordova. And that stack works pretty well, at least for building simple, web apps that you want wrapped up as native applications. But what we've really found is that a lot of these web apps, that they just don't have the performance and also the device capabilities that a lot of our users were using. And I mean, also our own, we build and maintain our own applications as well for internal and personal use. And we're also seeing these problems with just performance, some things just not being able to do the things we do, not being able to do the experiences that we see on apps on our own phones as well. And so we spent a lot of time building or really trying to push the Cordova stack. We still to this day maintain one of the biggest Cordova plugin repositories out there, and we built things to just push the boundaries in Cordova, really try to do page transitions and all of these other things. But at a certain point we realized that we needed to completely jump ship and just try to build something from the ground up that really focused on building native user interfaces first and foremost.
Can you speak a little bit about how this the approach that you took compares to some of the other alternatives that are available for using Angular to target mobile devices?
Yeah, so I think Cordova or Ionic, which built on top of Cordova, is probably the logical place to start. And the biggest difference is really in the user interface. So what Cordova and by extension PhoneGap and Ionic do is they essentially take a web view or a mini browser and they wrap that up as a native iOS or Android application. So what we do instead is we do not create a web view. We still run JavaScript code, but essentially most of the NativeScript magic sits with interpreting that JavaScript code and going back and forth between the JavaScript context and actual native iOS and Android APIs. So to the user, the big difference there is the user interface that you're interacting with is really no different than an application that you're building in iOS or in Xcode or Android Studio. I mean, the result is exactly the same. We're still building native binaries that with these completely native user interfaces. So that's the big difference with Ionic. I mean, some of the other things that are sort of in the space are like Xamarin, for instance. Xamarin is similar to NativeScript in the sense that you end up with a native user interface. Xamarin, though, does use C# sort of as their development language, and they do somewhat similar. Their architecture is a little bit different, but they come from the .NET world, from the C# world, so everything they do is very focused on that solution. And we're big proponents of JavaScript and TypeScript, so it's sort of our different approach there as well.
And how do you get JavaScript running inside of, how do you get it running inside the environment of the mobile devices?
What we do is we take a JavaScript virtual machine, so the bit of software that actually runs and interprets JavaScript code, and we actually package it up within the native binaries that we ship on iOS and Android. So the way I like to sort of explain it is, if you think of how Chrome uses V8, right? So V8 is what actually interprets the JavaScript code that Chrome runs. But V8 doesn't know about things like the window and the document object. So if you look at the ECMAScript spec, you won't see window or document, right? So Chrome has to have a mechanism to tell V8, here's what the window object is, here's what it does. Here's what the document object is, here's what it does. So with NativeScript, we take a similar approach. We're using the exact same APIs essentially, but we're saying instead of the window and document or all of these browser things that the browser needs to know how to do in a JavaScript context, we're injecting iOS and Android things. And then the real nitty-gritty of NativeScript, if you really want to dive in deep, is a whole bunch of C++ code that's essentially talking to the JavaScript VM and sort of making that transition layer back and forth. But the good news is that really all of that to the average user that's using it is sort of abstracted from you, right? So you don't necessarily need to know all that's going on behind the scenes, kind of like if you're building a web app with jQuery, Angular, whatever, you don't necessarily need to know what Chrome is doing under the hood to make your JavaScript execute. You just sort of write it and go on your way.
So what is it about Angular that made it possible to create such a tight integration between NativeScript and Angular?
So the first one was the language. So we were written, most of NativeScript, at least all of the NativeScript JavaScript code that runs at runtime has been TypeScript from day one. So we like to say we were using TypeScript before it was cool and before a lot of people were doing it. And that's actually what piqued our interest in Angular the first time, when they switched to Angular. And then also they made an announcement when they first announced Angular 2 back, who knows how long ago that was now, but they made an announcement that they wanted to decouple Angular from the browser. So Angular 1, you can't use it out of a browser context. There's specific code in there that says, I have to touch the DOM to do things. But Angular 2, they very distinctly wanted to make that break. So really between those two things, like sharing a language with TypeScript, and then also Angular really almost like looking for a partner. We worked with them for quite a while to sort of make this proof of concept, like really show that Angular could run outside of a browser. I mean, to this day, we're really pretty much the only implementation of Angular that runs outside of a browser environment. Because even if you think of Cordova, Ionic, etc., they're still running in the web. They're running in a web view, which is essentially an embedded browser.
I guess Universal might be similar, right? Because it runs on a server, so I'm not sure what happens with the DOM when it runs in Universal, but
that's a good point.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of the prerequisites. You do have a JavaScript implementation of NativeScript that you could use without Angular, right? So
correct.
And in that environment, you can use NativeScript and JavaScript, right? Or JavaScript
Either
or
or.
NativeScript. Yeah.
Yep.
So I guess then it sounds like NativeScript was more like being able to run, or the fact that Angular uses NativeScript is nice, but it's not necessarily required to use NativeScript.
Yeah, so really NativeScript is pretty low level. Like back to my explanation of, it's really just a JavaScript VM. It's just a raw JavaScript interpreter back and forth. And so because of that, you could build pretty much anything on top of it. Where Angular really slots in for us is if you are not using Angular with NativeScript, we have our own implementation of things like events, of things like data binding, of modules, of structuring your apps. And what we found over time is that one of the biggest issues people had in terms of learning curve with learning NativeScript is learning those things, because you couldn't have come into NativeScript knowing, for instance, how our data binding implementation worked or how our eventing system works. So with Angular, we have the opportunity to say, hey, you know what? Like if you are an Angular developer, or even if you're considering Angular, these skills you're learning with Angular are directly applicable to being used in your NativeScript apps. And also gave us a lot of conventions, like for instance, people still to this day want like a NativeScript style guide, for instance, to say how they build their apps. Well, now that we have Angular support, it's like, hey, Angular has a style guide. You should totally use that. And Angular has testing systems set up, and we're really able to leverage all of those things that the Angular community builds to benefit NativeScript developers as well.
That sounds great. So, what did you learn about what it takes to integrate a framework while integrating Angular with NativeScript?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because we get this question sort of a lot, like why Angular, which I kind of discussed earlier, but also like people asking for React or Ember or Vue or any of these other, or I think Aurelia has come up before too. And I mean, I think what we learned is that because NativeScript is low level, because you can build on top of it, it's totally possible to build on any of these architectural stacks. Like we've done some research into React, we've gotten like some of the basics working, and we could do this with other frameworks as well. But we found that the cost of actually taking that implementation through to like a finished thing that we could offer to our users actually is quite high, and it's even not quite the engineering stuff, because some of it is. Like some of the work is just, we have to make Angular's routing system work in NativeScript, because Angular's routing system out of the box uses URLs, right? It changes the hash of the URLs. Well, if you're in a native iOS app, there's no URL. If you're in an Android app, there is none. If you're making an HTTP call in Angular, you're using an XML HTTP request. Well, that doesn't exist in NativeScript, so we have to implement that. So there's that just straight up grunt work. But the harder part is actually what comes after that. Like as soon as you say you support a framework, you have to get into, well, there's got to be documentation on how to use all of those things. We have to have sample apps. We have to show people how to use this. We have to have, all the various things, templates for building our apps, and et cetera, essentially, which is the real cost, because obviously you have to maintain those things over time as well as things upgrade, and that ends up being the real cost of adding on one of these additional frameworks.
But do you think it would be easier now to add other frameworks now that you guys done the Angular implementation, like in theory?
So yeah, easier yes, easy no. I guess would be the answer.
Right.
Like we sort of know through trial and error, like some of the specific things we hit when we got working with Angular, but. The thing is, like I said, I don't want to like make it sound trivial in terms of so the work that was involved. I mean, this is all open source, which is one thing that's kind of fun. So the sort of glue that brings NativeScript and Angular together is an npm package called NativeScript-Angular. It's also open source. It's github.com/NativeScript/NativeScript-Angular. And so anyone that was interested in sort of the effort it takes or the code, like you could just go look in terms of just the sheer code base that's there to make it happen. And that's the glue for sort of runtime. But then there's also, as I mentioned earlier, samples, templates, docs, and that sort of thing as well.
Well, if someone was kind of wanted to take this one step further or wanted to reach out and ask you about something like this, how could they find you on the internet?
So there's a couple different places. We have our community forums, which is at forums.nativescript.org. That would be one place to sort of kick off the conversation. You can always do like a GitHub issue on one of our repos as well. If you are seriously, interested in committing to something serious, I would say we also have our community Slack. If you just Google NativeScript Community Slack, you could find us. And you could just ping one of us. I'm TJ Van Tol on there. Some of my colleagues, Jen Looper, you'll find us sort of lurking in there as well. So just ping one of us and we can kick off a chat. We can loop in the appropriate people to sort of have a higher level conversation of the specifics of what would need to happen.
It's really exciting to see what you guys did with Angular, and it looks like a really amazing integration. I'm actually really excited about trying it out. So thank you so much for doing all this work and making all this happen.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Hey there. Are you into reactive programming using JavaScript? Do you have to deal with asynchrony in your web app? Then join this instructor Ben Lesh to learn all of the ins and outs of RxJS in his hands-on workshop. Available online and in person, go to rxworkshop.com for more details and to book your spot today. Hey there. Do you use Angular? Do you like fun in the sun? And how do you feel about boats? If you're nodding yes, then come join us on NG Cruise to learn more about Angular while on a fabulous Caribbean cruise. Check out ngcruise.com for speaker lineup, workshop details, and to book your spot today.